Morning, everybody. I'm Matthew Crabb from QA Media and QA Financial, our information site on software quality assurance at financial firms. And I'll give a brief introduction to our first speaker and then allow him to give you some more background on himself and his role at Danske Bank. Here's Hernan Huwyler, and he's talking about a topic that's absolutely core to what we do at QA Financial. He's going to be talking about IT risk management, a broader perspective on IT risk management, in particular security control governance, but also how banks are increasingly looking to establish standards for code quality and software quality. How do you minimize software risk? So Professor Huwyler is Senior Lead for IT Risk and Control at Danske Bank in Copenhagen. And as I said, I'll allow him to introduce himself a little more fully. Over to you, Hernan.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for the introduction and the invitation to be here at this event in order to share good practices and ideas. The journey for this session is to offer 10 important controls in IT that we can use when we are developing applications. And when we talk about risk management, we are talking about IT. It's a very hot area, and there are a lot of ideas and practices and standards and requirements that they are changing over time. I've been playing with risks and controls in the last 22 years in the IT area, and each day there is something new. So we're going to cover what are the most important things that we need to consider in development. Let me just share the presentation, and you should be able to see the slides now. And we're going to cover cyber compliance. This is an area that we are seeing regulators in the financial industry being very concerned. They are getting us good requirements in order to articulate in process and procedures across our functions. And then finally cover 10 topics for controls that we need to consider in the development area. And then finally, we want to have some times at the end for discussions. So please ask questions, and I will try to address them in the session. If time is not enough, I will take it after that. So let's go for cyber compliance. And in the banking industry, we have good guidance coming from the European regulator, the European Banking Authority, the EBA. And we have some guidelines, and there is a chapter for system development. So basically what they are requiring us is to have the proper controls, and the controls formalized in policies and SOPs, which are listing which are the security requirements and which are the functional requirements that we use in development. So which is our posture for the banks when we are developing applications. Then they want banks in Europe to have a proper protocol to accept changes when we go to production. When we say this is the development, this is the change, this is the new version, and we go and finally impact our clients. Then they are asking us to set a proper methodology for testing. They are not prescribing any fixed standard, but they say that they should be rational for choosing one methodology and ensuring that whatever the methodology is, we can justify to regulators which are our choices, and more important, how we are living up the requirements that we set. Then They are asking for the segregation of production from testing and development. Nothing new here, but in practice, it's always a challenge. So they are also asking banks to protect the source code integrity, how we are ensuring that we are in control of the coding and the sources, who can make changes on that, how we are also ensuring the versions there, and how we are ensuring that all the coding is complete when we are making our repositories. And finally, they are asking to keep a register of business critical applications. These type of registers of IT assets are very important in terms of IT risks. So we can identify risks from assets. And lacking this repository is always going to be a problem in terms of the risk assessments. Then we have a new regulation. It's coming into our countries in Europe in the last year that they had been enforced in the different countries, that is a guidance on outsourcing. And we have circumstances in banks that we are outsourcing the development of applications. So all the applications that they are critical, that are part of the core activity for a bank, that they are outsourced for development, we need to identify the security and operational risks in the contracts. So we take the contract and we start analyzing clause by clause that the vendor needs to do, which are the risks, and how the bank is reacting to the risk, is preventing the risk to happen, is monitoring that the risk is not materializing. Then they are also asking about the due diligence on potential vendors, how we assess the capabilities of a vendor that is going to develop an application for us before we sign the contract. Very, very important. Before we decide whether it's a go for the application, we need to do this due diligence. And also, once that we have a contract in place, we are ongoing due diligence, performing the ongoing due diligence on the contract clauses. So we can check that the security control, that the application control, the quality controls are implemented at the vendor's organization. Then we need to audit. And we can do the audit by ourselves, or we can get also certificates. And a new requirement that is very important in the industry right now, particularly for the discontinuation risk because of COVID, but also because of this regulation, is that we have the proper exit plans. We are prepared to recover the service if the outsourcing service provider fails at executing the contract. And finally, we have privacy by design. This is also very important for banks. We need to integrate privacy and data security in the development stages. We need to assess vulnerability and risk affecting privacy, not only for the banks, but also for the data subject. How important is this personal information to be protected, not for the organization, not for the fines, not for the needs for the organization, but also for the data subject? Are we posing new risks related to impersonation, related to fraud for the customers, or sometimes employees, depending on the type of development? Also, we need to minimize the processing of personal data. Replications, different over collection of data, personal data should be minimized in the way that we are designing the development. And also who has access to data, and very important in the design, when we are creating the requirements document, we are being sure that we can encrypt data, that we can anonymize data, and all the security protections are being covered. So let me go to the second part. My first advice here as a control is that you need to have the inventory of all the hardware, software, and firmware that is going to be impacted by the development. And in that inventory, whether it's existing, so you know your vulnerabilities, you know your risk already, or is going to be procured or developed, you need to ensure that all these components in the software design had been risk assessed, and you know the vulnerabilities, and you are addressing the vulnerabilities for all the assets. This is one of the main problems that I see in practice, that we are missing a proper inventory of all the IT assets that are going to be impacted by the development. So that is why it's control number one. Is the first control in practice that we need to be very sure. If we don't understand the scope of the changes, the assets that are going to be impacted, what is going to be what is being evaluated for the organization to procure externally or to develop internally, we cannot decide what to do. And this is a major problem when we are trying to do risk management that is more than paper compliance and producing a document that somebody is going to say, okay, it's done, go ahead and do the development. My second advice here, the second control that I want to recommend you to think about is how to separate environments. How we are ensuring that non-productive data is in use for testing and development. This is something that is coming from decades in development, but still is always a challenge. There are several solutions, from using dummy data to masking here. The most representative data is coming from solutions related to scrambling. So, and we have challenges. We have challenges in order to ensure that the testing and the development environment is representative of the production environments. It's always a challenge. And data scrambling, it's a good solution in order to get this separation of environments. Protect personal data, protect confidential data, and ensure that the environment is consistent with procurement, with the production, sorry. So consider an scrambling solution here. Then other control that I found useful is when we are simplifying the semantic in the documentation for developments. Using the right vocabulary is extremely important to simplify the documentation, from the coding, in order to reduce the complexity and being sure that all our stakeholders are able to understand the terms in a simple way. From having a proper glossary of definitions in SOPs to having data dictionaries, using a simplified semantics, it's very, very important to put people, to get all the people in the same page. Other recommendation that is impacting our IT approach to risk is quantification. In the old days, 10, 15 years ago, when we had development and we needed to have risk assessments, we were pointing fingers in the air and saying red, yellow, green, catastrophic, 1 to 5, a scoring system like data cocktails, data moving from what and that, doing business impacts, and basically assessing risk with adjectives and bias assessment. We cannot explain that rationale to regulators. We cannot say that data is not relevant, is not available for our decision making. It's not right. It's we cannot say that there is no data to assess risk in IT development. So My recommendation here is to quantify risks when you are engineering software development, when you are planning. Risk is decision making, it's planning. So when you are developing the plan for software engineering, use historical data about issues, delays, constraints, overcost. You should have at least the ambition to improve the data that is being taken in consideration for the risk assessment in your project. You know the historical data there. You should have data from disputes. You may have also data that is coming from all type of incidents. We are capturing those incidents in the banking industry. We need to. And then when IT development is assessing risks, there is still a challenge to go and use this data. Also, we have another tool that is very, very important that is called calibrated estimations. For some projects, we may not have historical data. We are developing a complete, a very different application, a completely different approach to one type of transactions with a market, with a new development application, a new environment. So the historical data is not existent or is not relevant or is not complete. In that case, you can use another exercise that is called calibrated estimations, in which you are asking subject matter experts to get an opinion about what frequent or what will be the different threshold for the impacts for these risks, and you basically are covering the most common responses. And how do you need to do that? Look at the assumptions. When you got your plan, look at the assumptions and measure the impact and the probabilities, not only for one scenario, but also for multiple scenarios. There are different tools in risk management, from decision trees to Monte Carlo simulations. Use those tools. Ask for your risk department to improve the decision making. Just, I am being very clear, using red, yellow, and green when we are doing this type of risk assessments in development is a malpractice, because we cannot justify putting the finger in the air and saying catastrophic. What is catastrophic? Catastrophic have a different meaning for me, for the regulator, for the customer. Only data, only financial data that is justified can be shown as the proper stress for the assumptions. This is risk management. Understanding the volatility for our assumptions in the planning. Also, we cannot comply if we don't have a clear list of requirements. That is also very, very clear, but still in practice, there are a lot of discussions about which are the requirements, who should set those requirements, which is a good requirement, what is acceptable and not, and this is not a struggle. So I highly recommend to have a control in which you are standardizing a single list for all the requirements that you need to consider in the development analysis stage. When you are analyzing, okay, this is the project, this is what we need to do, have a list for capabilities, storage, performance, interface, recovery, testing, compliance, data definition, licenses, access technologies, everything set in a single list with a single custodian and a single owner and the right governance. that is going to be relevant for different projects, for different subsidiaries, for different type of development, of course. But having a centralized and a standard list will help us to comply. I have seen many cases that we are trying to reinvent the wheel for one analysis to the next one. That we are just doing a lot of discussion that they are not needed. We need to show consistency for the regulators, for any type of challenge, any certification that we need to get. Then we can decide whether the requirement is good or not. We can improve on time, but if we don't have the right governance, if we don't go in that way, it's not gonna fly. Also, any exemptions for abnormal events terminating execution in your development plan should be formalized. What are you gonna do? Ensure that you got auto recovery, that you got a log for all these type of events when there is a timeout, that there is an element, a component that is not found, that some objects cannot be selected or they are invisible. Always get a proper project to handle exemptions. Then another important control is to separate code from data. This is also a big problem in practice. It's a well-known principle, it's a well-known control, but still we are struggling to live up this control. So use templates for ancient frameworks and any third-party tool that you want to move all these values to the header files. So you have a file with all the data and then it's separated from the code. Very important that you got the proper control formalized about how do you want to do that, because it's always a challenge. Then you need to define which are the control for refactoring, which are the events, which are the changes that are triggering a code to be refactored. So before you are adding any new feature or improving a new feature that is going to production, you are refactoring the code. Get this, have a very good SOP here saying, okay, these are the events that requires this activity to happen. Then certificate the user accesses for developers twice a year. This is my recommendation. There is nothing written that it have to be twice a year. It depends on the organization, how many developers we have, but at least as a benchmark, ensure that all the developers for all the environments have the accesses for that are in compliance with the least privilege principle. So the need to know privilege. Do it in a very holistic way for all the applications, all the development environments, all the testing environments, even the production environment, to be sure that we are properly segregating accesses. And finally, let me recommend to use a good testing emulation. So combine different operative system, browsers, and mobile system when you are testing. Emulate different combinations, because we are seeing a lot of problem because this control is not being enforced, and we are not properly testing the environment that we should. So maybe we can go for questions. I see some questions in the chat. Or maybe Matthew, you want to ask something?
Yes. I mean, Hernan, first of all, thank you very much. You've touched on a lot of topics, a lot of very important topics. We probably only have time for one question. We've only got a couple of minutes, but I'd like to ask about these standards, these various standards for code quality, for data, for security. You've talked about the EBA, and you've talked about the importance, the EBA's guidelines, and you've talked about the importance of internal controls at banks. To what extent are banks actually sharing best practice? And do you see the emergence of shared standards? Let's just take code quality, for example, because there are different methodologies. Technical methodologies like static analysis, there are code repositories you mentioned, there are ISO standards. Do you see an evolution of cooperation and shared standards and sharing amongst financial firms?
No, not really. We have ISO. The ISO is a consultative process. I've been part of that consultancy where we are developing ISO standards. But in terms of the proper collaboration in the way that we should be aligned, at least to address regulators in a consistent way, I don't see a level of collaboration. The SOPs, these practices are very confidential in terms of each financial institution, and that is a pity. We need these forums at least to have the overarching approach. We also depends on the vendors to move in terms of consultancy and solutions, the coordination in the community. But personally, I would like to see much more collaborations. I am coming from the academic, so it's also a way that we're always sharing best practices. We need to, maybe because my aspirations are more, are higher. I would like to see more collaboration, definitely.
Okay, good. Well, as you pointed out, I mean, that's one of the intentions behind this forum series. I think we have to leave it there. Very sadly, we only had half an hour. We could have discussed each of your 10 smart controls in much more detail, but why don't we do that in another session another time? And Hernan, you've put your contact details up there. I hope you don't mind if delegates contact you directly if they would like to continue the discussion. Would that be okay?
Absolutely, absolutely. We need to get this community. So thank you, Matthew, for the opportunity to be here and building up this community in the Nordics.
Thank you, Hernan.